All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, AJ, for the introduction. I'm Rebecca. I'm here to present on my comps presentation project, which was a research paper called The Showrunner, Hannibal and the Question of Television Authorship. So I knew from pretty early on in my comps process I wanted to work with television, but I wasn't really sure where. Television's in this really cool transitional moment where we're starting to take it seriously as art, we're starting to change the way we watch television, Netflix original series, and we have all these cool social media and digital tools that are popping up that are changing the way audiences and producers interact. But what I found I kept coming back to in my comps process was this idea of a television author. So authorship is a really big idea. The question of who's responsible for a piece of work or how much they're responsible gets really complicated. And especially with television, where you're looking at hundreds of people involved in a single television show, that gets really big. But what we're finding as we move forward in the digital age is we've got this new idea of what an author in television looks like, and we call it the showrunner. So it's only kind of shown up in the last 25 years. We've only started talking about it seriously in the last 5 years. And I realized that's where I wanted to focus my comps project, on what the showrunner is, how it's used, and how it relates specifically to a case study. In my case, Hannibal. Cool? So here's a kind of brief roadmap. I'm going to talk a little bit about what a showrunner even is. And then we'll delve into the fun, nitty-gritty stuff of Hannibal, and I'll talk a little bit about what I found in relationship to the industry and NBC, and what the fans are doing in relationship to the showrunner. So, what is a showrunner? On its most basic level, the showrunner is a writer-producer who's responsible for the day-to-day operations of the show, and the artistic vision of the show as a whole. So they tend to be lead writers, they tend to be early creators, they tend to be executive producers or producers, so they have money invested in the show. And they tend to have a really strong social media presence, so they tend to be really involved with their fan base. So showrunning started as a production practice in the 1970s, actually. Television was changing, they were moving from the kind of monster of the week model to more serialized arcs. And they were moving from freelance writers to having a stable writer's room. And they realized they needed somebody in charge. They needed a manager. They needed someone who knew what the heck was going on with these television programs they were creating. So the showrunner showed up. And this role kind of grew and grew and grew, but it wasn't actually mentioned in popular culture until the 90s. So in the 1990s, the first appearance of the word showrunner in print media was in reference to ER in the New York Times. And that was the first time we ever really started talking about it. And it's grown since then. It's become a much more important role. It's become a much more prominent role, to the point where the showrunner is now synonymous with their show. So, The West Wing. You automatically think Aaron Sorkin. He's the showrunner. Buffy the Vampire Slayer is Joss Whedon's show. He's the showrunner. So we've got this really tight relationship between the showrunner and what the show actually is. But here's the interesting thing. Showrunner isn't an official production role. It's not real. So, okay, I'm gonna say it again. It's not real. It's constructed. So the thing about the showrunner is when you're looking in the credits line, you're not gonna find it. You'll find created by, you'll find developed by, sometimes you'll see executive producer, but you're not gonna find showrunner. There's no showrunner guild. It's a construction. It's just as important for us as an audience as it is for people in production who are doing this behind the scenes and in very different ways between different shows. Right, so that's really cool. So why do we even talk about the showrunner? Why is it even important to us as an audience? Well, one of the things that I found is that the showrunner provides authority. So one of the big things that the showrunner does when you're talking about a television show, when you're talking about the visibility of the showrunner, they talk a lot about their plan. They know where this show is going. They know what's going to happen. They have a 6-year plan, 6 seasons in a movie. They know what's going to happen. And they also talk a lot about intentionality. So they say, what has happened was meant to happen. Nothing that was on this television program was a mistake. I meant to do that. Nothing is weird or not supposed to be there. It's all supposed to be there. And both of those help maintain an audience. That the plan says, oh, I can trust that this television show will continue to be quality. Or I can trust that what has happened, even if I didn't like it, there's a reason for it, so I should stick around. Now, one of the most important things that I found that showrunners do is they talk a lot about their interpretation of the show. So the showrunner is the guy with the right answers. The showrunner is the person who has the correct interpretation, and they talk about that interpretation a lot. So the showrunner is always a very vocal aspect of managing meanings of the show. So the showrunner determines kind of how we're talking about the show, and vocally are addressing the audience and saying, hey, this is what my show is about. This is what I want to do with it. Now, how does that relate to our television? So I looked at Hannibal, which is an hour-long drama on NBC. It's got 2 seasons right now. A 3rd comes out this summer. And it's a really weird show. It's based on the novels of Thomas Harris. So Red Dragon, Hannibal, Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal Rising. It acts as a prequel. It's pretty loosely adapted. And it's really highly cinematic. It really loves being subtle. It really loves its symbolism. It really wants to invite analysis. But it's also got this huge engaged cult fan base. So it has this huge audience that are dedicated to the program and who are really interested in talking about it on social media, on having a social media presence, and a relationship with the producers of the show. So that's pretty interesting. And it kind of gives me a good area to kind of talk about the showrunner. Because when you have this kind of high level of engagement, it's easier to see the places where everybody's interacting and what the dialogue actually looks like. So Hannibal's, one of the reasons for this kind of engaged cult audience and this high level of engagement is Bryan Fuller. Bryan Fuller is the showrunner of Hannibal. He's a weird dude, it's a weird show, we just roll with it. He's best known for his kind of dark, quirky comedies, Pushing Daisies, Wonder Falls, Dead Like Me. Most of them involve death somehow. And he's also a huge social media personality. He's got a Twitter, he lives on his Twitter, and he uses it to talk to fans. He retweets fan art, he retweets publicity, he retweets interviews, he answers fan questions. If someone has a question about something that happened in the episode, he'll answer it on Twitter. He's incredibly involved on a digital scale. And that helps him talk to the audience about what's important to him about his show. So, Hannibal is a network show. It's on NBC, and NBC wasn't really sure at the beginning what to do about this show. It's this engaged cult audience, it's this very vocal showrunner, and they just didn't know how to deal with the incredible amount of content that was coming out of the fan base that Bryan Fuller was coming out with. And so they realized they really needed to manage the meanings of this show. And this is something that a lot of network shows do, that a lot of networks do, where they try to manage the meanings that come out of the show and how we feel about the show. Because they want to make money, they want us to keep watching, they want us to like it, and they want us to feel a certain way about it. So what NBC did is they had this huge social media presence. So when you're looking for NBC Hannibal official publicity, you're going to find it everywhere. They have an official Twitter. They have 2 official Twitters. They have an official Facebook. They have official Tumblr. They have an official Snapchat, and it's getting there. So NBC decided to be everywhere. And they do that to manage the meetings for the audience, to tell us how we should feel about that show. And they do that by amplifying Bryan Fuller's voice and his interpretation and his preferred meanings of what's going on with this show. And another interesting thing that they do, they actually separate themselves from the showrunner. So we as an audience tend to think of shows, we think of the network and the producers, we think of them together. We think of them as kind of top-down, talking down to us. But NBC wanted to really break that. And so they separated themselves from the showrunner, where you have Bryan Fuller on high speaking to you, and NBC in fan spaces speaking like fans and appropriating fan language to try and circulate those meanings as if they were fans. Now this is a kind of obvious construction, but the thing is it works. They are using fan language to talk about the show, explain the show, and minimize the reinterpretation process of fans. The thing is it doesn't always work. Because the thing about audiences is they talk back. And we have so many cool ways to talk back these days, it gets pretty neat. So I'm going to tell you about one of the examples of the way fans of Hannibal talk back, and that's flower crowns. Okay, so flower crowns, it was a phenomenon in 2013 where everyone started photoshopping flower crowns onto characters. It started with One Direction, actually, and it spread everywhere. But it kind of died down for a lot of people, but Hannibal people were just like, yeah! And they were there, and they stayed there, and it became synonymous with the Hannibal fandom, to the point where people who were doing costuming of characters would include a flower crown, just because they'd seen it in so much art, right? So that's a huge, huge deal. They were discussing symbolism of flower crowns. It was everywhere, to the point where they actually gave flower crowns to Brian Fuller and most of the actors. So the fans do this incredible thing, and the producers embrace it wholeheartedly. This next image is a little bit disturbing. It's a corpse attached to a tree. I'll tell you when it's over. This is from season 2, episode 6, Fudamono. You can see there's a kind of halo around this guy's head of flowers. His body is also filled with flowers, and they're all symbolic flowers. Mostly the symbolism that was in the flower crowns that the fans created. So this is a huge part of season 2. Okay, it's safe. So the producers adopted the flower crown, and they appropriated this kind of fan culture to change the show. You know how I was talking about how the showrunner is this kind of authority figure, that they have this plan? The fans can change the plan. And that's really, really, really cool. And they do that by talking back to the showrunner, at the showrunner, and about the showrunner. So that even now, flower crowns are a big deal. And the thing is that they're a big deal for the producers because of the fans. And that even though the producers have adopted them, it started as a fan practice. And that's pretty cool. So, I'm going a little bit fast, but don't worry about it. So I get to talk about this a little bit more. So one of the coolest things and most important things that fans do is they read oppositionally. So they have a reinterpretive process. So they tend to look at the things that the showrunners say and go, no, I don't agree with that. And so they'll reinterpret the show in a completely different light. So there might be one scene in Hannibal with a pomegranate in it. And then a fan will completely reinterpret the entire show in terms of Greek mythology. And that's pretty normal. There's a couple of different ways fans reinterpret that I looked at. One of the biggest ones was mimetic jokes. So they would take catchphrases from the show and they'd turn them into these really complicated mimetic jokes. There's a catchphrase in the show, "This is my design." It got reinterpreted, so "This is my design" became a fashion designer. So instead of talking about murder, he was talking about art. And so these kinds of jokes, there's these kinds of jokes, and then there's fan art. So you can draw the characters in new situations, you can reinterpret what the characters might think or feel or talk about or what to look like. And then one of the most interesting things I looked at is called meta. So meta is essentially critical analysis. So the stuff we do in CAMS classes, but for fun. And outside of the academic setting. So you have these really complex theoretical essays. One of my favorites that I read took the entirety of Hannibal and reframed it in terms of Tam Lin, which is a fairy tale. It was incredibly complicated, it was very good, but it's not super supported by the text. Brian Fuller's not going to retweet that being like, that's exactly what I meant to do with this show. It's a reinterpretive process. And so these fans read oppositionally against the showrunner, but they still use the showrunner as kind of a point of contact, as an anchor point. So one of the things that we do when we talk about author kind of discourse is we talk about something called word of God. So it's a fan phrase, but it means kind of things that the people who are in charge have said about the show. They may not be exactly in the show, but they're about the show and a big part of it. So what fans will do is they'll use these word of God utterances to explain their interpretation. It might be an offhand comment that Brian Fuller made 2 years ago, jokingly, and it will be used to pull together this entire interpretation. Or sometimes it will be, these Word of God utterances will be used to discredit other fans. So fans will say, Brian Fuller doesn't believe that. You're wrong, Brian Fuller doesn't believe that. So the showrunner becomes kind of an anchor point and a point of conversation in order to try and understand the show, understand meetings within the community, even as NBC from outside attempts to bring in Brian Fuller's meaning to everything that fans do. So that's a lot. And that's essentially what I try to do in my comps, is look at all of these influences and try to make some sort of sense of them. And honestly, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Hannibal's a complicated show. We have a lot of content out there. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about kind of what my takeaways were. So the showrunner is a really useful concept, but it's an incomplete author. It can't account for all of the influences on the show. It can't account for our culture. It can't account for the way the fans interact. It can't account for network interference. There's a lot of things that go into a television program besides the showrunner, but we find it still really useful. It's also a way to manage meetings for Hannibal. It's a way to learn how to talk about the meanings of the show. And it's also something very interesting is that the showrunner has power because we as an audience give it power. We say that the Word of God means something, and we talk to people about it as if it matters. The author is dead, but we bring him back, and we brought him back as the showrunner. And I think the most important thing I learned is that the showrunner is still evolving. In the 70s, we didn't really have a conception of Facebook or Twitter. We didn't really have a conception about the way that television would change. And it's still changing, and it's still moving, and it's still growing. And I think the showrunner is going to grow with it, and become more important with it. Okay, so this isn't the time where I thank people. Carol, Jay, Paul, Marla, the entire Kim's department, all my fellow majors, all my friends and family. And I think it's time for me to ask some questions, get some questions from you guys. Hey, Henry.
Cool. Here we go. Okay. Hold on. Yeah. Okay, we got it. Okay, so the showrunners that are most well known are people like Fuller and Dan Harmon and Ryan Murphy. People who are well known for having incredibly stylized television shows. Would you, because you mentioned that not all shows really have a showrunner, would you say that that's a fairly consistent trait of the shows where the showrunner is kind of an appropriate job description necessarily? Because it's like you have shows like Glee and Community, which are very stylized as well as, and Hannibal is of course too.
Yeah. So the way I'd like to answer your question is to say showrunning is gendered. Okay. It's gendered, and it's also pretty auteurist. So showrunners tend to be male. They tend to be going towards a cinematic and more experimental style. They tend to be organized by difference, right? So they tend to be special, exceptional, and that's the way they like to frame themselves. So if you have a special, exceptional show, it's tend to be associated with its showrunner, whether or not the showrunner is actually responsible. And so when you have shows that really don't have a showrunner, it tends to be because we think of them as lowbrow or lower class or somehow lesser television. So daytime television, reality TV, they don't get a showrunner. And a lot of that is because one, classism, and one, it's mostly women watch reality TV and soap operas and are associated with that. So when we're looking at this phenomenon of having a showrunner, it's just as much about gender, it's just as much about genre as anything.
So you arranged this around a case study, and I just wanted to know what other shows did you consider as for case studies, and like how did that relate to you choosing Hannibal?
So I considered Community, actually. Community, I almost did Community. I didn't. I think one of the, And I have to be honest, the reason I didn't choose Community is because I didn't want to watch season 4. But I chose Hannibal and a lot of reasons for the kind of things I was telling Henry about, where I thought there was this kind of interesting gendered phenomenon, especially because most of the fans are women, right? So most of the fans of Hannibal are women, and they're getting this kind of on-high information from the showrunner. And Hannibal is a highly male-coded show in a lot of ways. So I found that really interesting. And since I really didn't know where I was starting out when I was started looking at Hannibal and what I really wanted to focus on, and I wanted to focus on the showrunner, there was just so many interesting tidbits in Hannibal I wanted to parse out. So I guess that's kind of why I chose it.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the evolution of this project and maybe what your sort of original intentions are and how that changed through the process.
Oh man, wow, it changed a lot. At first I was gonna look at serialization in television. I was gonna look at the way like having breaks every single week affected like a dialogue between authors and readers. And then I realized I couldn't find an author of television, and I freaked out. And then, it went through a lot of evolutions. It was originally going to be way, way, way more narrative theory and a lot less fan studies, but I think that the shift did it good. So it's evolved a lot based on what I could find and what eventually I started finding interesting. But it was a very different project on the outside.
I'm interested in this question of incomplete authorship.
Yeah.
So you talked about it more in connection with network influence and fan influence. I'm thinking about what about specific authors or specific episodes? So the showrunner runs the show, and they usually have a rotating circle of usual authors. But then even within there, they don't have full control generally, and they're guest authors. So I'm thinking like Neil Gaiman guest authoring a couple of episodes for Doctor Who, like. Obviously, he had basically full creative control because it's Neil Gaiman, and who let him do it. So, what do you think about that aspect of they can't account for everything?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the most interesting things about television because, this is the Cinema and Media Studies department, and we study a lot of film. And a lot of ways we do that is by talking about the auteur, the director. But we can't really do that in television because we're dealing with a different director for every episode, essentially, a stable of writers instead of a limited number of writers, and this evolution. And so I think that's one of the big ways the showrunner falls short as a reality of an author, and is much more powerful as an idea than an author, because you can't account for everything, especially in such a big production process. Even when they change showrunners, you sometimes still get this continuity because the showrunner wasn't actually involved in the first place. So I think it is a really complicated question. But I think that's a very good question because I think we need to actually figure that out, where that goes.
I guess in this specific case, I don't know if you're familiar with Game of Thrones.
Yes.
Who would you consider the showrunner? Because David Benioff and D.B. Weiss are present and they do communicate with the fans, but at the same time, George R.R. Martin is also kind of a showrunner, but not.
Cool, so I would say that the two guys you mentioned, they're the showrunners. They're involved with the day-to-day operations, and most importantly, when stuff goes wrong on Game of Thrones, we blame them. We don't blame George R.R. Martin. We blame them as adapters. And so I think that the important thing about Game of Thrones is that we do associate with the two brothers, which I think is interesting in and of itself. But yeah, I would call them the showrunners, especially since they're so tightly involved with the direction of the show, the creation of the show, and they're always like, we know what we're doing with the show. We've got the plan from George R.R. Martin, and we're going to do a slightly different thing with it. We know where we're going, we promise. And so that's really where I see them as showrunners and see them talking as showrunners.
So you talked about the showrunner as being a power that's basically given by the audience. Was there at any point where you saw that power being challenged by somebody else in the production crew, such as an actor or one of the writers, where the audience took their word of God over the word of their chosen God?
So actually it's really interesting because I didn't get to talk about one of my favorite people involved in Hannibal, Janice Poon. She is a food stylist. So Hannibal's not a cannibal. the food's kind of important. But she has this really great blog where she talks about kind of the direction she wanted to take the food and her ideas about the food. And a lot of what she does is actually interpretive. So she says, I used white asparagus here to represent finger bones because I feel in this episode we are dealing with skeletons in a certain kind of way. So she's very separate from Fuller, and there's a lot of people who really actually prefer Janice Poon in the way she talks about the show. But this is a well-heeled show as well, so everyone's kind of got it together and their message together. So they're pretty cohesive under Brian Fuller's direction. So they'll say, well, Brian Fuller wanted me to use white asparagus here to represent the way skeletons were in this episode, rather than kind of branching out on their own. There's a couple of little examples where that happened, especially in season 2. But for the most part, it tends to be fairly consistent in Hannibal.
So you talk about MS and NBC as taking a backseat to Fuller's sort of artistic direction. This might sort of be in contrast to your conclusion a little, but do you think there's any extent to which Fuller or other showrunners maybe sort of folded figureheads and there are like, you know, marketing teams and focus groups that are sort of dictating, like, you know, MSNBC's like dictating his.
Oh, no, I think that there is definitely an element of being a figurehead. I think that in Hannibal itself, it's less true, but I know that there are shows out there where the showrunner is just as much kind of a publicity stunt as a person. Because their showrunners are good publicity. It's nice for audiences to have someone to look to. And so when they don't have a really strong showrunner or a really strong personality for a show, sometimes they create one. So yeah, I do think that there is an aspect of figureheadness. But one of the things about the showrunner is that each showrunner is different and runs their show differently because it isn't a standardized role. So we find different levels of engagement across the board.
Do you see showrunners as available for non-blockbuster series?
That's an interesting question. Yes, and in fact, they're kind of growing, especially on the CW, actually. But where you tend to find them is with one, serial television, especially dramatic television, and also things geared towards young adults. So young adults and kids, people who are probably going to invest a lot of time and energy becoming kind of a cult for the show, being huge fans of the show, you're going to find stronger showrunners there because that's how they maintain their audiences through that engagement with the showrunner. Excuse me.
In your research, did you find any female showrunners of prominence?
Shonda Rhimes, but she's pretty much the only one, unfortunately. Hopefully, we'll get some more pretty soon as television grows and we get more good television. But so far, we've got Shonda Rhimes, who is great, but not enough. And I have time for one more question.
So clearly you went, this was a really long journey for you and you worked really hard on it. So I guess my question is, would you say this project is your design?
Yes, on that, thank you very much.